Today's scripture reading comes from the book of Mark, chapter 4, verse 35 to 41. Hear now the word of God. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. These days, I'm sometimes afraid of watching the news. The past week, the conflict in Sudan, where ethnic cleansing burned down 68 villages. There was, in Sudan, ever since the Civil War, about 68 villages were burnt down. And last week, there was 2 stabbings in Belgium, Brussels, where two people died and another was critically injured. And as we all know, the Ukraine war is still ongoing. And according to the New York Times, it is said that around 500,000 people have been either killed or wounded. And as we all know, in the Middle East, there is the conflict between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians who are caught between it. And there is this big scepter of greater conflagration, fire, that foreshadows that region. And it was just as we were starting to forget the conflict between the Israelis and the Jews and the Palestinians. Israel as a country was making unprecedented foreign policy progress as it was growing closer to the traditional Muslim countries such as Saudi Arabia and Iraq and other countries in that region, where cooperation was the exception and not the norm. Both the Muslim and Jewish countries were overcoming the history of conflict towards cooperation little by little. But this is when Hamas decided to initiate an attack during an important Jewish holiday. And this conflict, this attack is seen as a very calculated move so that it drives a wedge between Israel and their allies. One of the focuses of the Israel and Hamas conflict is that the use of asymmetrical warfare and tactics has been used to a great effect. The use of paragliders, ordinary drones, weapons and cars and civilian equipment meant that it was very easy to wage war and deal damage by both ordinary people and terrorists. And this is also easily seen in the conflict in Ukraine, which has come to redefine the way in which modern battles are fought. The advent of drones meant that tanks could be made obsolete very quickly. The use of technology such as Starlink and digital warfare changes the way in which battles are now fought and won. This civilian technology is linked and can be used for war. What this means today is that a few special high-tech weapons are not enough to change the tide of war, as we have seen with the use of hypersonic missiles by Russia. But the tide of war is changed through the use of everyday items and products in which we are the most familiar with. The war in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe might not directly affect us today. It is both very far away, and it deals with countries that are not directly linked to our economy and politics. But they always have the chance of spiraling out of control, leading to a greater war in which could result in global consequences. We might think that, okay, this war, the conflict that's going on is very far away and it has nothing to do with us. But the reality is that we as Koreans in the Korean Peninsula are still living in war. We have to remember our war with North Korea did not end with a truce, but a ceasefire, meaning that it could return anytime. In addition, the failures to prevent the war in Israel and in Ukraine means that we have to be more careful of our own systems and faults. The wars in Ukraine and Israel has been attention grabbing for people because of the same possibilities of it happening to us in South Korea. And this has made people very anxious. And I just want to remind you that I'm not a historian nor a political expert, and this pulpit is not a place to talk politics. I'm not here to make people anxious about the wars in the distant foreign land. But what I'm trying to say here today is that these conflicts and wars is not just a faraway event, but a real event that could happen to any of us in this place. And what instead I'm perhaps a little bit more qualified to do, even if a little, is to help us see God in times of conflict. Not just conflict, but also in times of perhaps depression, trouble, anxiety, and hardships. Because I think the truth is that we have already so much on our plate that the issues of war in these far away places is like an additional source of stress. As I was preparing this sermon, I looked up some statistics in Korea, and it said that in 2022, depression patients in Korea have exceeded 1 million people, according to the Korea Herald. And that is an unforeseen number of patients in Korea. And they say the people who refuse to come out of their house, which we know as hikikomori, are increasing. And people are more fearful of the future because they have not been preparing for the future. People are afraid of rising interest rate because that might just pop the bubble of the housing bubble in which a lot of our saving and money is invested. There are these fears that also on the news these days that you see of cars' sudden and unstoppable acceleration. And there are other fears such as the recent stabbings that have become prominent in South Korea as we have never seen before. And with the proliferation of social media platforms and services, we are left more anxious of what's going on in the world. And we also have this anxiety of perhaps being left behind. And we have even a greater fear of missing out while others are getting in. And coupled with this platforms, the competitive nature of our society and economy means that we live in this state of anxiety. We have these constant deadlines, targets to meet, expectations to fulfill in our works, in our family, at school, with our parents all the time, and there's never a break from them. Your job might be on the line, or you might have people breathing down your neck, or you feel like what you do right now is going to determine your future, and because of that, you're so anxious. And now on top of that, as I said before, we now have this war in far eastern Ukraine and in the Middle East, which adds to the anxiety and uneasiness. And I think when you think about our lives, it is, I think, irrefutable that we're going to face hardship sooner or later. If we can all agree that we're going to have times of trouble, then we can also agree that we will also face hardships in our faith as well. But the question is that, what are we looking at when our storm hits, when perhaps the times gets hard? In today's reading, Jesus and his disciples decided to take a boat across the lake to go to the other side. And on their way in their boat, a large squall, a storm rises up, in which overwhelms their boat. And on this boat there was Jesus and perhaps 12 disciples or more. Even though the exact figure is not given, we know that it was not a small number. And as we know, some of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. And that meant that they knew their way around the boat, around the waters, and around navigation. It would not be an exaggeration to call them specialists, the fishermen, as their work was probably done generation by generation. So the followers of Jesus probably, who were fishers of men, lived their whole lives on the boat. And the disciples who were sailing on the boat did not expect any trouble, because if they did, they would have perhaps taken another route. And if they were expecting trouble, they would have assumed that it would be quickly and easily resolved. There was an important person with them after all, and they would think that whatever problems they have faced, they will be okay. And then the storm comes, and the water starts to rise and starts to come into the boat. And I'm sure they must have tried to start bailing out the water as soon as they saw that the water was starting to sink the boat. But they probably didn't realize that their actions were futile, because long into the water bailing, because up to a certain point, they probably tried to solve it with their own strength. And when they realized that it was not enough, that was when they decided to seek Jesus, who was sleeping in the stern of the boat. Mark 4, verse 35 to 38. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" I think, like the disciples, when we are confronted with a problem, we, like them, try to solve the problem with our own strength, with our own hands. And this is a very natural human reaction. We do not think about going to Jesus first with our problems. We instead try to solve it by ourselves, whether the problem is small or big. Even if it's a big problem in which we cannot solve it by ourselves, we still tend to try first before going to Jesus as the last resort. The disciples went to Jesus when the boat was not a little swamped, but almost swamped, when the boat was almost going to sink, not when the water started coming in. They only went to Jesus after they tried everything they could and they could not find a solution. And I think it's similar with us as well. We tend to go to Jesus as the last resort. We tend to seek God when we tried all other methods and failed to get the solution we want. Another point I want to focus on here today is that Jesus was asleep during the storm. How could Jesus be peacefully sleeping during a storm? Either he was very trusting of his disciples, perhaps very tired, or even negligent. Or what if Jesus was just trusting that God was in charge? Or perhaps, like the disciples claimed, he didn't care. But whatever you think is the reason that Jesus was asleep, what we notice here today is that Jesus was not asleep anywhere on the boat, but it specifically says that Jesus was asleep in the stern. The stern is in the back part of the boat where the rudder is placed. The rudder is like the thing which directs the boat. And this is the place where the captain of the boat usually resides. And if a rudder is present, this is where the rudder directs the direction of the boat. And the rudder is the control of the boat. It directs where the boat goes and the place where the captain usually resides. So if we see the significance of the place where Jesus was, we see that Jesus was in charge of the situation the whole time. Within the storm, there are those who are overwhelmed by it. It comes to define who they are, how they act, how they think, and how they see themselves. But there is also Jesus, who is on the same boat, peacefully asleep. We are on a boat like the disciples, and we have the choice to be defined either by the storm or to be in this at peace with Jesus during the storm. We have the choice to be defined by worldly worldly goals and standards of success that we will always be in a state of constant anxiousness. Or we have the choice to be at peace in the midst of it all with Jesus. We cannot have heavenly peace of mind, a heavenly heart, without Jesus at the helm of our boat. Although the boat might seem to us to be sinking, Jesus knew that everything would be okay. But if you are not with Jesus, every storm that hits the boat is going to seem like it will sink the boat. And while this was going on, the disciples were panicking. Jesus was in the stern asleep. When in the disciples' eyes the end seemed near, the boat seemingly about to sink, and they couldn't find any other solution, they come up to Jesus and wake him and say, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And if you have read the previous chapters, Jesus who healed the sick, Jesus who was with the sinners and marginalized people with the disciples, is asked this question, "Jesus, don't you care if you drown?" And I think it must have sounded very ironic because they were the ones who was closest to be with Jesus. And they come to Jesus not fully understanding who he was or fully believing in his miracles yet and what he would do in the future. And I think, like the disciples, we also have the same questions when the storm hits. Jesus, why am I suffering? Jesus, don't you care if I'm drowning? Jesus, why can't you help me solve this problem in my life? And the truth is that Jesus does care. As we have seen that he was with the sinners, with the marginalized, and with you on the boat, and with the disciples on the boat. It was just that we have not humbled ourselves to come to him. And once Jesus wakes up and takes charge of the boat and the disciples, he rebukes the wind, and the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Mark 4, verse 39 to 41. He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." When the disciples sought Jesus and allowed Jesus to take charge, he rebuked the wind with words, and the wind died down and became completely calm. And we see here today that Jesus is greater than the storm, in which nature obeys him. Jesus is greater than the storms, the wind, the waves, and even death in which they were facing. And the disciples who witnessed this were shaken with this experience. And instead of being terrified of the storm, they were even more terrified of Jesus, who commanded the winds and the waves. And the focus in which we should have in our lives is not on the storm, but on Jesus in all things. As the sailors on ships look at the stars for guidance, we should also look to Jesus as guidance in the night in times of distress. Our focus in life is to be on him who is greater than the storm. And the more uncertain, the more challenging, the more we want to fix problems for our own strength, we need to instead turn to Jesus and surrender our problems to him. And that is when we will find peace like Jesus, who is sleeping in the storm. For he is greater than all tribulations. Whatever problems we face, we have to know and remember that God is greater. What we need is Jesus and not a solution to the problem. We need God not because he's the current solution to the problem and that he's going to come and save you, but because he is greater than the problem. And that is what we need to recognize in our lives today. God does not want to be the solution. What he wants to be with us, what he wants to do is be with us during the storm as we live our lives in this world. He wants to be in our lives always, in both times of trouble and in times of peace. He is the one who will bring us the courage to face problems, who will help us walk in the valley of the shadow of death. He will be the rock on which we stand, and we must find refuge in him in times of trouble. And God wants us to find peace and strength in him through the storm. I want to end today's sermon with a story I once heard from a previous head pastor. A business owner who, and this is a true story, a business owner who had a good business before the coronavirus was hit very hard by the coronavirus pandemic in 2019. As his business was going bankrupt, the business owner who was an elder, came to the head pastor to ask for prayer. And of course, the head pastor, who also felt the effects of the coronavirus in his church, was able to greatly sympathize with the elder's position and situation. And as the head pastor was consoling the elder asked not for a miraculous turn of events that would bring his business back out of financial trouble, but that he could go bankrupt with his faith intact as an elder. Although the elder knew that his business was soon going to fail, he asked that he would not fail as a Christian, keeping his humility and grace and no remorse to God. And the head pastor was greatly moved by the faith of the elder, and he sincerely prayed that God could give him the courage to hold on to God even through the storm. Although it was the end of the elder's business, it was not the end of his life nor his journey. And it was a turning point, an opportunity, where the elder could confess that God is greater than the storm. And he weathered out the financial difficulties, and today is back on his feet, although not rich as one might hope, but more blessed for sure. Jesus is not the solution to all our problems, but what we must see is that Jesus is greater than all the problems. Jesus doesn't want to be the solution to all our problems. What he wants to do is be with us during times of trouble, in our storm, so that we may experience his grace, his peace. Jesus is our strength in times of trouble, and he is our shield and our living water. Jesus is our friend and our reward. As we remember today's message, let us confess that Jesus is the Lord of the storm and our lives as we sing as the deer. Let us sing as the deer.